They thought he was just a kid, too young to be a threat, too scared to matter, too small to stand in the way of a column of trucks, tanks, and armed men wearing the eagle on their uniforms. And that was their mistake. Because by the time the German battalion realized what had happened, it was too late. A teenager with nothing but a bike, a sharp mind, and a reckless kind of courage had already outplayed them. He was 16 when the war swallowed his town. Before the uniforms, before the shouting, before the soldiers took over the school and the square and the roads, his world was small and simple. Friends, chores, stolen afternoons by the river, and a bike he loved more than anything he owned. He fixed it himself, polished the chain, knew the sound it made when it was happy and the sound it made when something was wrong. His father had fought in the last war and rarely talked about it, except for one lesson he repeated whenever the boy got into trouble. Strength isn't always about muscles, his father said. Sometimes it's about seeing what others don't. At the time, the boy thought it was the kind of thing adults said to sound wise. Then the soldiers came, and suddenly the difference between seeing and not seeing became the difference between life and death. The battalion arrived early one gray morning. Trucks grinding over cobblestones, boots slamming in unison, flags snapping in the cold wind. They took over the town hall, turned the school into a barracks, and set up roadblocks at every entrance. They brought rules, too. Curfews, ration stamps, restricted zones. Anyone who asked questions disappeared. That's when the boy started noticing things. He noticed which officers always checked their watches, which direction the patrols took at the same time every day, how long it took for the sentries at the north entrance to get bored and start smoking, looking away from the road. He never wrote any of it down. He just watched, remembered, and stayed quiet. Until the day he overheard something he couldn't ignore. He was delivering bread from the bakery, another job stolen from a man who'd been taken away, when he passed the back of the occupied town hall. He wasn't supposed to be there, but his route made sense on paper, and as long as he kept his head down, no one stopped him. That's when he heard voices through an open window. German, low, tense, hurried. He didn't understand every word, but he caught enough. A map rustled. A voice said the name of a nearby village, one that still had children, old people, farmers who thought the war was something that happened far away. Then he heard numbers, units, times, references to clearing and securing. He froze. His heart pounded in his chest. Someone inside laughed. He forced himself to keep walking, hands steady on the breadbasket, eyes fixed ahead. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing those words over and over. He knew what clearing meant now. He'd seen enough. By morning, he'd made a decision. He couldn't stop the war. But maybe he could stop this. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell the few adults who still carried themselves with quiet defiance. He just took his bike. He'd memorized the patrol routes over weeks without realizing why. Now that knowledge burned under his skin like fever. He knew their weak spots, the moments when the road was empty, when the guards looked away, when the trucks hadn't yet started their engines. He waited until just before dawn, when the world still felt half asleep and even the soldiers' boots seemed to drag. Then he slipped out. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs. His hands shook as he gripped the handlebars. Every shadow looked like a rifle. Every echo sounded like a shouted order. He pedaled anyway. At the east checkpoint, a guard yawned and fiddled with his cigarette. The boy rode past without looking at him, as if he belonged there, as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Wo gehst du hin?" the guard called lazily. "Where are you going?" "Farm," the boy answered, in clumsy German he'd picked up from hearing curses in the streets. He pointed ahead, as if the answer should be obvious. The guard glanced at his watch, at the empty road behind him, and waved him through. It was a small decision, meaningless by itself, but history is made out of small decisions. Once beyond sight of the town, he released the breath he'd been holding. His legs pumped faster. The bike rattled over stones and mud, the chain protesting the sudden speed. Fields blurred past, the sky slowly bleeding into pale light. He wasn't sure what he would say when he reached the village. He only knew what would happen if he said nothing. His mind worked as hard as his legs. He couldn't go to the local police. Not anymore. They were either powerless or compromised. He couldn't rely on letters or messages. The Germans controlled the post. So he did the only thing he could. He arrived breathless, mud on his trousers, eyes wide, and asked for the priest. The priest had known him since he was a child. He listened, at first with confusion, then with growing horror. The boy spoke quickly, stumbling over details, trying to recreate the bits of conversation he'd overheard. "How sure are you?" the priest asked quietly when he finished. "Sure enough that I left before breakfast," the boy said. The priest stared at him for a long moment. Then he made a decision of his own. "Go home," he said. "Slowly, carefully. If you are right, you have done enough." But the boy didn't go home. Not really. Because on the way back, the plan began to form. The German battalion believed in order, timetables, clear lines on maps. They believed that once a plan was written, the world would comply. The boy knew better. He'd seen cows escape fences, horses refuse to move, wagons break their axles on bad roads. He knew that the gap between on paper and in reality was where chaos lived. So when he saw the narrow bridge over the creek on his way back and the deep ditch beside it, an idea took shape. He couldn't fight a battalion with weapons, but he might be able to fight their schedule. He hid his bike in the trees and slid down into the ditch. The soil was cold and damp. He dug with his bare hands until his fingers ached, prying loose rocks, loosening the earth under the edge of the road. He found old roots and hacked through them with a broken piece of metal he'd found, sweat mixing with the dirt on his face. He worked until his arms burned, until his nails were black with mud, until the ground beneath the road was just unstable enough that anything heavy, like trucks or tanks, might have a problem. Then he climbed out, dragged branches into the ditch to hide his work, and rode home as the sky brightened into a new day that didn't feel new at all. The battalion moved out the next morning, just as he'd heard. Tanks rumbled, trucks followed. Men checked their weapons, confident. They had a plan after all. Written, approved, expected to succeed. They took the road he knew they would. The shortest between 2 points. The most efficient line on the map. At first, everything went smoothly. Then they reached the bridge. The first truck crossed without incident, but the second hit the weakened edge at just the wrong angle. The road sagged. Wheels slipped. The driver cursed and tried to correct, but the weight of the vehicle was too much for the damaged ground. The road gave way. The truck lurched sideways and crashed, blocking the tight crossing. Men shouted, engines revved. The driver of the next truck slammed his brakes too late and collided with the first. Someone fired a shot in panic that hit no one but echoed like a warning. The columns stalled. Vehicles lined up behind them in a growing metal snake, trapped on a narrow stretch with no room to turn and nowhere else to go. Officers yelled orders, gesturing angrily. Some tried to back up. Others tried to move forward. No one could agree. Minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. By the time they finally managed to clear the crossing, move the damaged vehicles, and salvage what they could, the schedule was ruined. And in war, timing is everything. Back in the village, the priest had moved quickly. He spoke to the farmers first, then to the women, then to the few men still there who had seen enough war for a lifetime. They left quietly, not in a rush that would draw attention, but in small groups, visiting relatives, attending markets, taking sick children to see doctors in distant towns. By the time the battalion arrived, prepared to secure the area and clear out potential resistance, they found a village half empty. The most vulnerable had gone. The ones who remained were harder to intimidate. It wasn't a victory anyone would mark on a map. There were no flags raised, no speeches given, no medals. But people lived who would have died, because a teenager with a bike and a memory had bought them time. Of course, the battalion never knew exactly what had happened. They blamed the road, poor local maintenance, bad luck. Some grumbled that the villagers had sabotaged it on purpose. No one suspected the quiet boy who delivered bread and kept his head down. He went back to his routines, heart pounding every time he saw a soldier glance his way. But no one came for him. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't brag to his friends. He wasn't even sure what to call what he'd done. But years later, when the war ended and people began to talk, really talk, about what had happened in those dark years, stories surfaced. Stories of villagers who just happened to leave before a raid. Stories of troops who just happened to arrive late. Stories of one boy who always seemed to know just a little more than he should. They called him many things in those stories: a scout, a messenger, a saboteur. But those who knew the truth called him something else. He was the teenager who outsmarted an entire German battalion, not by being stronger, not by being armed, but by seeing what others didn't, and having the courage to act before it was too late.